Hi guys. Okay, we are back with the next video for the section 8 of the notes. We're going to finish it up from where we left off yesterday. What you got to work on tonight is the review guide for Unit 4, the multiple choice. Notice that it says homework, civic literacy, essay outline. Okay, I am going to make a video where we do the whole outline. But what you're doing is what we were doing in class. You're going to go through, you're going to answer the questions about the documents. You're going to read over the question, you're going to jot down the information that you would take from the documents, and you're just outlining it. You are not writing the essay. You're doing what we usually do together, but you're practicing it on your own. We've done a few of these together. Now it's time for us to see how you do when you're on your own. Now, with this one, there are 6 documents and then the outline. So it might take you, if you want to break it up, you want to do it over a couple of days. That's why I gave it to you on a Friday so that you have time to work on it. But you're not writing the essay. Notice it says outline there. I want to make that really clear. Okay, that should take care of that. We are going to hop right into the final piece of the New Deal programs. So I'm going to say this again. When we started going over the New Deal, I told you there were 3 different sections. The 3 R's. We had relief to fix the immediate problems. We had recovery to make progress through the problems. And then we had reform. Relief, the immediate problems that we had to go after. First, we had to fix the banks. That was that banking holiday. Second, we had to fix the unemployment, and those were those public works programs, the PWA, the WPA, the CCC. And if all of that sounds like crazy, messed up abbreviations, you need to go back and watch a couple of videos before this. Then we had recovery, where we saw we're tackling some problems that can give us some security for right now in the moment. We need to recover from the depression. In that, you see going after industry with the National Recovery Act. You saw us taking on agriculture with the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And you saw us making more jobs, providing long-term civility in the Tennessee Valley Authority. And if those don't sound familiar, go watch the video from right before this one. But now we are to the final R, which is reform. Long-lasting reform to make sure that we never ever have another depression ever again. So what do those look like, you ask? What a wonderful question. First, we are going to start with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Let me get my pen ready. This is known as the FDIC. Maybe you've seen this before, and if you have, maybe you've seen it in a bank, because this was created to provide reform in the banks. This is going to be created under the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. That is a heck of a name. But what it does is it meant to give depositors, or people who put their money in the banks, some security. And the way that it did this is it said, if in the future those banks collapse again and we see bank failures like we did in the beginning of the Great Depression, then the federal government is going to refund deposits in the bank up to $2,500. That sounds pretty good. That is meant to get rid of the panic that came after the stock market crash, when everybody went to the bank and tried to pull out all of their money, and the banks didn't have it because they were making poor investments. So this is meant to provide a long-term fix to that problem. We are now restricting the banks from using those risky, reckless practices when it came to giving anybody anybody who wanted money, getting money from the bank is no longer. It also stopped the bank from using depositors' money in the stock market, so they couldn't gamble with our money anymore. As this went on, the Banking Act in 1935 is going to make the FDIC a permanent plan. So that means it's going to stick around forever. And what it does is it extended that coverage to say 100% of whatever the deposit is in the bank is what the government will cover. Now, you might be thinking, where the heck is this money coming from if the government is going to give it back to the people? Well, that is also a fantastic question, and I have a video for you to watch that is going to explain just that.
FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is a lot like Severus Snape. Here he is. This is the best that I could do, I'm afraid. You may remember that Snape was Harry Potter's potions teacher at Hogwarts, and a deeply misunderstood fellow. Kind of like the FDIC, which is much maligned by a lot of the American public. There are those on the left who claim it's just a big corporate welfare fund for big banks, and those on the right who say it's poorly managed and could end up costing the taxpayer billions of dollars. Now, the FDIC, though, like Severus Snape, has got our best interests at heart. It's got a number of roles, which include regulating some banks, but its main job is to safeguard our savings. Here we go. And it does this by acting as an insurance fund. Now, it is owned by the government, but it's not funded by the government. It's kind of much more like your health plan, where workers put a certain amount of money into the plan every month. Then if somebody gets sick, the fund managers dip into that pool of money and pay the doctors. In the same way, banks pay money into the FDIC, and then if one of them gets sick or goes bust or runs out of money or whatever it is, then the depositors don't have to worry about their savings because the FDIC will dip into the pool and make them whole up to a certain amount. Now, the big concern about the FDIC is that if a whole bunch of big banks go bust all at the same time, well, then the fund could run out of money, in which case it's going to go to the government, and the government would step in and bail it out with taxpayer dollars. So clearly, just like Severus Snape, the FDIC does have some issues, but it has our best interests at heart. And
so what we can see from that is where the money would come from if we ever have to bail the banks out again. So it's insurance, just like you pay your medical insurance or your parents pay it, and one day you'll pay it. You put up a little bit of money, and that money goes to the government in case of an emergency, and then there is a fund to pull from. We just have to make sure that people don't ever panic and go and pull all of their money out of the banks all at one time, because that would be bad. But next time you go to the bank, look for this little sign down here, and if it is FDIC insured, then you know you're in a safe place to put your money. The Securities and Exchange Commission, known as the SEC. This one, put a nice big giant star next to, and what it does is it fixes the problem in the stock market. That's what we want to make sure we remember. So what this does is it regulates commerce, which is business, in stocks, bonds, and other securities. So in the stock market before, we saw prices just skyrocketing overnight. And the reason this would happen was because businesses were kind of slimy. They weren't letting people know that that stock was based in reality on actual sales that their company was making. They were just kind of making numbers up. But under the Securities and Exchange Commission, if you are a public corporation, you have to register your stock sales. So you have to say who's buying and at what prices. You have to register your distributions. You have to register your financial disclosures. So what you're selling, who's giving you money to run your company, what investments those look like. So companies have to be completely transparent now in where all of their money goes and what happens incoming and outgoing of sales and things like that. And it has to be truthful information so that when their investors choose to buy stocks in their company, they know exactly what they're getting into. What the SEC really was meant to do is this piece right here. It's meant to fix all of the problems of the unregulated stock market. And we want to make sure that we don't have another stock market crash like we saw on Black Tuesday. And this SEC was going to help us. What it also creates is the Security and Exchange Commission, which is an independent government agency, which means they're separate from the government, that is meant to carry out all of these regulations. So it's all fine and dandy when the government says we're going to regulate business and all of this good stuff, but if they don't actually do it, have somebody boots on the ground making sure that this stuff is happening, then it doesn't really matter. So that Securities and Exchange Commission really holds people accountable and makes sure that the stock market is doing what they need to do and that we are preventing fraud. This one, maybe you have heard of. Another piece of permanent reform is the Social Securities Act. So, Social Security. Today it's taken on a little bit different of a form, and we're going to watch a video here in 1 second about Social Security through the ages, but let's first address the problem that it's fixing. So you were seeing so many people being unemployed and so little jobs. And when people didn't have a job, they didn't have their savings anymore, everybody was looking for a job. It didn't matter what age you were, young, old, extremely old, everybody was competing for jobs. And what the government comes to realize is we can't possibly have enough jobs in the market for everybody at all ages. We need to figure out a way to slim down the number of people that need a job. And what they look at first is the elderly, because we want the younger people in those jobs, but the elderly were also competing for those jobs because they quite frankly didn't have any savings. There was no pension. There was no, okay, save for a rainy day when I'm ready to retire. Retirement was not a thing during this time. So we need to create something that encourages people to leave their jobs so that the younger generation can come in. And that's where we see Social Security. So what we're doing is we're taking people who used to live paycheck to paycheck and setting them up for a better future. The Social Security Administration was created under this act, and what we were doing is creating a contract between generations. Current workers in the workforce were going to pay into this Social Security fund, and then retirees, the elderly, would take a monthly stipend from that fund. Those age 65 and older are the ones who are taking from the fund based on the contributions that they made when they were a part of the current workers paying in. So it's this reoccurring cycle of the young pay into a fund that they will benefit from when they get old. The elderly benefit from it in their present. So you pay in to eventually get a payout. This also created, though, unemployment insurance that's funded by employers, because being older isn't the only time that you may see yourself without a job. Sometimes you get hurt. Sometimes you get laid off. And we need to set up some kind of security, Social Security, to take care of that. FDR said it in a beautiful way. He said that this was meant to create security against the hazards and vicissitudes of life, because you never know what is going to come at you. And just think about it. The name itself, Social Security. Society is providing security for each other. Now I want you to watch this little clip and see how Social Security has kind of evolved from the Great Depression into now.
Social Security is a system where people pay an extra tax on their payrolls and wages to fund government assistance programs and benefits. Today, money from Social Security payments provides pensions to the elderly, the disabled, the unemployed, and their dependents. But Social Security hasn't always existed in America. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt changed all of that when he came into office in 1933. FDR was not only tasked with helping Americans survive the Great Depression, but also with figuring out how to improve the lives of people in a rapidly industrializing America. How could America provide its citizens with a social safety net if an economic downturn were to happen again? Upon taking office, he announced the New Deal, a series of programs and projects that aim to provide relief for Americans and institute crucial economic reforms. However, critics complained that these measures were too conservative and temporary in nature. A variety of social safety net proposals gained broad popular support across the nation. So, in 1935, FDR announced the second New Deal, which included the Social Security Act, signed into law on August 15th. Workers pay into pension funds, and once they retire, they receive payments back from that same fund in proportion to their own payroll deductions over the years. Implementing Social Security was not an easy task. To secure the system against attacks from its political enemies in the Republican Party, the Roosevelt administration set up the system as an insurance rather than a welfare program. Every citizen was assigned a Social Security account number. During the remainder of the 20th century, Social Security went through many changes as the act was amended several times. The 1939 amendments added dependent benefits for the spouse and minor children of a retired worker, and also survivor's benefits to be paid to the family of a covered worker in the event of premature death. In 1950 and 1954, Congress made farm and domestic service workers eligible for Social Security. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed into law amendments to the Social Security Act, which established the Social Security Disability Insurance Program. Under President Johnson, the amendments of 1965 created Medicare, a basic program of hospital insurance for persons aged 65 and older. In 1983, under Reagan, further amendments made Social Security payouts subject to taxes and began to gradually raise the age of retirement. To this day, Social Security remains a central part of many elderly Americans' lives, allowing them to feel some economic security in their old age. The proportion of retirees to workers on payrolls increases as Americans have longer lifespans, leading to increasing debate over the viability of Social Security, the centerpiece of FDR's New Deal legacy.
So what we see here is that Social Security is going to take on different forms as we evolve. And there is a debate now where is Social Security going to be around forever? Is it long lasting? And we'll talk about that more as we get into how Johnson handles Social Security and the changes made at that point in time. But Social Security during this time was made to be a right now fix. Eventually, people were supposed to catch on that they should be saving, that they should be investing in their future, but we haven't quite gotten there yet, and that's why it's still around. Last piece for today, last piece of reform. So, what we also had to take care of was workers' rights because even knowing we saw high unemployment and people really struggling to get a job, the people who had jobs and that were getting hired in some of these factories, they really didn't have it that much better. The conditions were still terrible. So, we had to take care of workers' rights. And what does that is the National Labor Relations Act. And we have actually seen this already. It is called the Wagner Act. Act, and you are going to want to, it's a terrible arrow, but you're going to want to underline that and make sure that you realize that that is also another name for it. It was named after the New York Senator Robert F. Wagner. And what this does is it guaranteed workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively. Remember, unions fight for the rights of the collective, the larger group, bargain, they negotiate to make change. This also created the National Labor Relations Board in order to enforce that the act was actually guaranteeing workers' rights and doing what it was supposed to do. Another piece that was put into place was the Fair Labor Standards Act, and I would put a star next to that because this creates the minimum wage, it guarantees overtime pay, it makes it a law that you have to keep record of when people are working, and it establishes youth employment standards, which is child labor. So we are now trying to get kids to go back to school. In the 20s, we talked about how the emphasis on education was expanding. That went out the window in the 1930s when entire families had to go to work just to get by. So kids weren't focused on school in the Great Depression, they were working. And in order to get those kids out of the workforce and back into school, we see the Fair Labor Standards Act be passed. And these pieces are the final chunk of the puzzle of the New Deal, and that is the long-lasting reform that we saw. Now, the last section of the notes, we're also going to break that down into 2 videos, and we are going to talk about the culture of the Great Depression. What were people going through? How did they feel? What were they experiencing during the Depression? Don't forget to do your civic literacy as I outline, and as always, any questions, please email me.